Most people think a recording session is about creativity, about soundproof booths, glowing boards, and the magic of music being born. But what I witnessed the night I sat in with Lil Nas X wasn't magic. It was something else. Something that felt alive inside the walls. Something that didn't want us there. And once I heard the voices, I knew I could never unhear them. When people imagine recording studios, they think about glamour, about neon lights reflecting on polished floors, velvet couches where artists collapse between takes, and plaques on the wall reminding you that hits were made here. And yes, there was some of that. But this studio, this specific place where Lil Nas X was brought, had another layer. It didn't feel like an empty building waiting for sound. It felt like it was already full of something. The first time I walked in, it caught me off guard. The temperature shifted between rooms in ways that didn't make sense. One hallway was comfortably warm, another icy cold like you just stepped into a freezer. The air carried a weight that wasn't tied to humidity or air conditioning. It was denser, like being underwater, where every breath felt borrowed. The lights buzzed in places they shouldn't. Shadows moved slightly offbeat from their owner. Most studios try to feel invisible, like blank canvases. This one felt like it had a personality. If a building could glare at you, this was it. The strangest part was that silver-handled door at the far end of the second hall. No label, no keypad, no hinges you could see. Just heavy, metallic. Wrong. Everyone called it maintenance, but I never saw anyone fix a pipe or carry out cables. It was locked most of the time, and yet, whenever I walked past, I swore it hummed. Not electricity, not equipment, but something slower and thicker, like the low growl of an animal daring you to come closer. That was the space chosen for Lil Nas X. I still remember the exact night he arrived. Most artists travel with a group, friends, publicists, assistants with iced coffees. But he came in stripped down, just him and a backpack slung casually on his shoulder. He had his usual charm, the grin that makes you think he's in on a joke no one else knows. But when he reached the end of that hallway, his eyes flicked toward the silver door, and for half a second, his expression dropped. Just a flash, like his body recognized something his mind hadn't named yet. Then the grin came back, and he walked toward the control room like everything was normal. The engineers pretended like it was just another night, but I'd been around enough sessions to know when people were lying. Their voices were too casual, their jokes too quick. They weren't relaxed. They were stalling. One of them finally said it. "We'll try him in the booth downstairs." Downstairs. I felt my throat tighten because everyone in the building knew there was no basement. We were already on the ground floor and the schematics never mentioned anything below. Still, nobody questioned it. Nobody except me. When the silver door opened, the air rushed out like something exhaling. I caught a glimpse before it closed. Narrow stairs sinking into darkness. Stone walls tighter than they should have been. The hum vibrating louder. I couldn't stop staring. I didn't move until Lil Nas X himself stepped through and vanished down into the shadows. His sneakers made no sound on the steps. The door sealed shut behind him and the hum filled the hallway again, steady and patient. Time worked differently then. Minutes stretched, seconds stuck. People around me fiddled with cables, adjusted levels, drank coffee they didn't touch. The usual chatter before a session was gone. It was silent, except for that sound beneath us, vibrating the floor. pressing against our chests. When he finally returned, it was almost an hour later. His face was blank, not tired, not excited, not anything, just reset. He moved as if he'd walked out of a dream he couldn't remember, but still felt in his bones. He sat down, put on the headphones, and the first sound that left his throat wasn't a lyric, wasn't a hook, it was a hum. It wasn't random either. It was slow, steady, eerily close to the tone I'd been feeling in the walls since the day I started here. Only now, it was inside him. The board lit up like it recognized him differently, more than before. And I couldn't shake the thought that the studio wasn't recording him, it was using him. I told myself I was imagining it. That's what I always told myself in this place. But that night, I knew better. The hum, the cold air, the silver door, all of it had led to this. The studio wasn't just capturing music. It was feeding on it. Feeding on him. I didn't go home that night. I should have. Everyone else wrapped up, said their goodbyes, carried on like nothing was wrong. But something about the way Lil Nas X walked out of that booth, the way his face was drained of expression, but his body moved with unnerving calm. It didn't sit right with me. I stayed behind, telling the head engineer I'd clean up the files. It wasn't unusual. Assistants often stayed late, but my reason wasn't professional. It was curiosity mixed with dread. I had to know what the booth had done. When the studio was finally quiet, I pulled up his raw stems. I've listened to thousands of takes in my life, some perfect, some rough, some unusable. There's always a fingerprint in a voice, something you can't fake. An inhale before a chorus, a tiny crack when the emotion pushes too far, the human texture that tells you it's real. But as I played his first take, something was wrong. On the surface, they were flawless. His tone was sharp, his rhythm exact, his breaths measured. Too measured. Voices aren't supposed to be that perfect. The waveform didn't just look clean. It looked manufactured, like the jagged edges of human sound had been shaved off. At first, I thought maybe the booth had used some hidden processing, maybe a secret chain of effects that automatically polished the track. But when I ran spectral analysis, the truth hit harder. There were other voices buried in his. Not backups, not doubles, not something that could be explained by layering. They were tucked inside the frequency spectrum in ways I'd never seen before. Softer breaths that carried a feminine flutter, almost like a second singer inhaling just behind him. Low resonances that dipped below the human register, vibrating the floor more than the speakers. When I slowed the track down, I could hear it more clearly. Tones that didn't belong to him, weaving through his voice like threads. And then came the whisper. I had looped one phrase, listening for distortion. Buried under the reverb, almost too faint to catch, came 3 words. Say my name. I froze. My first instinct was denial. I told myself it was bleed, maybe a producer mumbling into a talkback mic, maybe interference from another recording. But when I scrubbed through the raw audio again, there it was. The same phrase, the same cadence, and it wasn't anyone in the studio. It wasn't even human. The voice had weight, like gravel dragged across concrete, deep and patient. Not angry, not loud. Worse, it sounded expectant. I sat there, hunched over the console, headphones pressing too tight against my ears, listening to something that shouldn't exist. Every time I raised the volume, I felt it more than I heard it, a vibration in my teeth, in my ribs, crawling under my skin. I yanked the headphones off and nearly laughed at myself. I was tired, right? That was all. Long hours overthinking. I'd seen enough strange sessions to know fatigue could make your brain invent patterns. So I did what anyone would. I tried to delete it. I selected the stem and hit delete. Gone. Relief washed over me for half a second until I reloaded the project. The file was back. No timestamp change, no error message. It hadn't been restored. It had never left. My palms went slick on the keys. I deleted it again. Reloaded. Back again. That's when the room grew colder. Not the draft of an air conditioner, not a fan kicking in. It was dead air cold, the kind of absence you feel in places that haven't seen sunlight for centuries. I wasn't alone. I didn't hear footsteps, I didn't hear a door, but I felt presence. And when I finally turned, Lil Nas X was standing there, not smiling, not looking at me, looking through me, like he hadn't walked back into the room but had always been there, waiting. For a moment, I couldn't move. My throat locked up. My fingers hovered useless over the board. He hummed one note, quiet but deliberate. It didn't match the track on the monitors. It didn't match anything. It was off time, off key, a crack in reality. And in that moment, I knew the voice buried under his recordings wasn't separate anymore. It was inside him. I kept my eyes on the sliders, pretending to work, my chest tight, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. But the hum in the walls had shifted. It wasn't waiting behind the silver door anymore. It was in the booth, in the session, in him. And for the first time, I realized the studio hadn't chosen him by accident. The next morning, I came in early. I told myself it was to get a head start, to be productive. But the truth was, I couldn't sleep. That whisper had burrowed into my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard it again. The studio looked normal on the surface. Engineers sipping coffee, a couple of interns arguing about plugins. But the air was wrong. Heavy, sluggish, like someone had stuffed insulation into the walls. I sat at the console and opened 3 raw files. One from a test vocal Lil Nas X laid down before going into the downstairs booth, one from after, and one from a harmony take. I lined them up, ran them through the analyzer, and my stomach turned. The pre-booth take was clean, human. The voice of an artist finding rhythm, flaws and all. The post-booth take looked different. The spectrum carried tones that didn't originate in his throat. They weren't artifacts or echoes. They were foreign fingerprints stitched inside the sound. I isolated the frequencies one by one. A flutter too delicate to be his. A resonance too deep to belong to him. I compared breath patterns. The one thing no singer can fake, but his breaths weren't his anymore. They carried other textures, rhythms that didn't match his natural style. It was as if someone else's presence was woven through every inhale, every exhale. And underneath all of it was that hum. At first, I thought it was feedback, a vibration just below the audible range, maybe interference from wiring, maybe a bad ground loop. I adjusted the EQ, cutting out highs and lows, but the hum stayed. I ran it through filters, slowed it down, sped it up. It didn't change. Then I fed it through a secondary analyzer. That's when I realized what I was listening to wasn't human. The waveform didn't match any vocal cord, any instrument, any machine hum. It pulsed irregularly, alive, like the lungs of something too big to see. When Lil Nas X returned later that afternoon, it was obvious something had shifted in him. He walked lighter, almost too light, like gravity itself wasn't holding him down. His voice carried an edge of precision that didn't sound earned. It sounded borrowed. He stepped into the booth again, and this time, he didn't wait for direction. He didn't ask for levels. He just closed his eyes, adjusted the headphones, and began to sing. But what came out wasn't just singing. It was layered. 2, maybe 3 voices spilling out at once. One was his, unmistakable. The second was softer, breathier, shadowing his words like an echo that arrived too soon. The third was lower, guttural, a vibration that rattled the glass of the booth, even though he never raised his volume. The board lit up like it recognized something ancient, something not meant for us. The engineers didn't flinch. That terrified me more than the voices. They acted like this was normal, like they'd been waiting for it. One of them even smiled faintly and muttered, "He's ready." Ready for what? I didn't ask. I sat there, forcing myself to keep my hands steady over the sliders, but my chest was tight, my skin tingling with a static that wasn't in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just hearing his performance. I was listening to something entering through him. Halfway through the take, he opened his mouth wider, and for a split second, the sound vanished from the monitors altogether. His lips were moving, his body trembling with effort, but no sound reached us. Instead, the hum filled the room, not through the speakers, through the walls, through the floor, through my own body. It shook my bones in a way sound shouldn't be able to. I glanced at the spectral monitor again, and what I saw made my stomach twist. The hum wasn't flat. It carried structure, almost like language, but in shapes our ears weren't designed to process. Beneath it, there was something else, faint, half-buried, but undeniable. A whisper. Not English, not anything I could name, but my body reacted before my brain did. Every muscle tightened. My throat went dry. I knew in that moment the booth wasn't just recording him. It was pulling something out of him, or worse, letting something in. When the take ended, he opened his eyes and smiled. Not his usual grin, not playful or bright. It was empty, like the smile of someone who didn't need approval anymore. The engineers clapped lightly, one of them saying, "That's the one." But my hands were shaking too badly to move the faders. I knew whatever we'd captured on that track wasn't music anymore. It was communion. By the end of that week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time Lil Nas X walked into that downstairs booth, he came back changed. His voice carried layers that weren't his. His presence grew sharper, heavier, like he was glowing from the inside out. And every time he left, the air in the studio stayed wrong for hours. Thick, electric, like the hum had followed him upstairs. The head engineer noticed my distraction and finally pulled me aside. He told me there had been technical issues with the wiring below. Something about clipping, maybe faulty insulation. Then he asked me to check it out. That wasn't my job. I wasn't trained for maintenance, but his tone wasn't a request. It was an invitation. That night, long after everyone left, I stood in front of the silver-handled door. It was already unlocked, waiting. I pushed it open, and the air rushed out again, heavy and damp like a breath that had been held too long. The stairs seemed narrower this time, the walls pressing closer as I descended. Each step sank deeper into silence until I couldn't even hear my own footsteps anymore. At the bottom, a single bulb flickered weakly overhead, casting the hallway an amber light that looked more like candle flame than electricity. The booth door was cracked open. I stepped inside, and the world disappeared. No sound, not the low hum, not static, not even the rhythm of my own breath. It was silence so heavy it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums, making my head throb. The foam-lined walls were darker than upstairs, almost black, and they seemed to ripple faintly, like they were breathing. And in the center of the booth stood the microphone. It wasn't the standard studio mic I'd expected. This one shimmered faintly in the dim light, golden and wrong. Its surface looked molten, as if it had been forged in fire and never cooled completely. It pulsed softly, like a heart at rest, glowing just enough to make me believe it was alive. The moment I stepped closer, something shifted inside me. My throat tightened, my tongue felt thick, my lips parted without my permission. That's when I heard it. Not in my ears, but inside my skull. A voice that sounded like me, but older, emptier, hungrier. Say it. I froze. My chest ached as if the silence itself had weight. Say what? I whispered, though my own voice echoed strangely, like it was bouncing off stones soaked in water. Say my name. The mic pulsed harder, glowing brighter with each unspoken word. I took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled my bones. I lunged at the handle. Locked. Cold metal bit into my palms as I twisted it uselessly. The voice grew sharper inside me, rattling my skull. Say it. Say my name. I dropped it to my knees. My mind raced through every name I knew. God, Jay-Z, Lil Nas X, demons I half remembered from books I shouldn't have read. None of them fit. None of them felt right. But something inside me wanted to obey. Wanted to remember a name I had never learned, but somehow carried in my blood. The glow around the microphone flared violently. The booth itself seemed to shudder. The foam-lined walls rippling as if they were alive, closing in around me. You want this? The voice whispered. You've always wanted this. Say it, and you'll never be invisible again. My lips trembled. I felt the word crawling up from my stomach, forcing itself into my throat. A name shaped like hunger, like silence. A name that didn't belong in human language. My jaw opened. And then, click. The door behind me unlocked. The silence cracked. The hum returned. Soft but steady, like the building itself was breathing again. The golden mic dimmed, its glow fading back to that slow, steady pulse. I scrambled to my feet and bolted. My steps thundered against the stairs, every sound a relief after the dead air below. I didn't stop until I was back in the hallway, my chest burning, my arms stinging. Only then did I notice the scratches. Thin, red lines across my skin where I'd clawed myself in the dark, desperate to get out. The studio above carried on like nothing had happened. Engineers sipped coffee. Someone warmed up scales in Studio B. Nobody asked me where I'd been. Nobody looked twice, but I knew the truth. That booth wasn't just recording music. It was feeding on souls, and it had nearly claimed mine. I tried to convince myself what I'd seen in that booth was exhaustion, stress, a hallucination fed by sleepless nights and too much caffeine. But denial only works when the evidence doesn't keep piling up. And every new recording made denial impossible. The next sessions felt different before they even began. Lil Nas X would arrive with that easy swagger, joking, smiling, humming under his breath like he always did. But the moment he was sent downstairs, everything shifted. The air grew colder. The engineers avoided eye contact. Even the interns, who normally buzzed with nervous energy, fell silent. Hours later, he'd return with the same neutral face as before. But his voice was no longer his alone. I began running side-by-side comparisons. I'd pull up one track recorded before he stepped into the basement booth, and another recorded after. On paper, the differences shouldn't have existed. His pitch was still clean, his tone still distinct. But buried inside, spectral analysis revealed details that didn't belong to him. One take carried a tremor in the vibrato, delicate and uncertain, like the voice of someone younger, someone untrained. Another carried the fluttering exhale of a woman's breath pattern. Then came the resonance, impossibly low, vibrating not just in the headphones but in my chest cavity, like the voice of someone far older than any of us. It was like the booth below was layering lives into him. The strangest part was how natural it sounded when played back. To most listeners, it wouldn't be noticeable. They'd just hear richness, complexity, a kind of it factor that critics drool over but can't explain. But I knew what I was hearing. These weren't effects. These were people. It became clearer one night when I soloed a harmony stem, isolating a section where his lead vocals trailed off. For half a second, I heard a run that wasn't his style, a series of notes that didn't fit his phrasing, a softness I recognized from another singer entirely, one I'd heard months earlier in a demo session upstairs. She had been bright, full of energy, talking about how this track would be her big break. And now, I was hearing her voice buried in his, faint but undeniable. My hands went cold as I realized what it meant. The booth wasn't just copying, it wasn't just enhancing, it was stealing. The young singer never came back to the studio after that demo. No one talked about her, no one asked. And yet her breath, her soul, her essence lived on inside Lil Nas X's recordings, like she'd been absorbed. And the engineers, they didn't flinch. One of them even played back a track, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "That's the future right there," he said, wiping his eyes like he'd just witnessed something holy. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was listening to someone else's life stitched onto another's. But my throat locked up. The words never came, because deep down, I already knew what he'd say. He'd shrug, he'd smile. He'd tell me, this is what greatness sounds like. And maybe he'd be right, because the world doesn't care where the greatness comes from. Only that it exists. But I cared, because I knew what the cost was. And I knew the booth wasn't done feeding. By then, I had trained myself not to react in front of anyone else. I'd nod along when the engineers praised the warmth in Lil Nas X's vocals. I'd smile when label reps said he sounded supernatural. None of them realized how literal that word had become. But when I was alone, I couldn't pretend anymore. Late nights in the control room became rituals of their own. I'd sit with the lights low, headphones clamped so tight they left bruises, replaying stems over and over. Each time, I swore I heard more. A half laugh buried under a chorus, a sob smothered in reverb, words that didn't fit any lyric sheet. Sometimes, in the silence between takes, A whisper would crawl out of the void and curl against my ear. The hum was always there now, even when no session was running. It filled the hallways, the break room, the stairwell. It followed me home. At night, I'd lay in bed and hear it under the whir of the ceiling fan, low and steady like a predator's breathing. Then came the reflections. It started small, a shimmer at the edge of the glass in the vocal booth, a shape that didn't belong in the playback window. At first I blamed fatigue. Eyes play tricks in low light, especially when you're staring at screens for hours. But denial cracked the night I saw it clearly. I was reviewing a late take, scrubbing through one of his leads. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark monitor. But there was someone standing behind me in the glass. Tall, unmoving, its form indistinct, more smoke than body. But the eyes were unmistakable, wide open, locked onto me, sharp as knives carved out of silence. I spun in my chair. The room was empty, but when I turned back, the reflection remained. It didn't move, it didn't blink, it just watched. My skin went clammy. I pressed my palms into my thighs to stop the shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Not until the figure tilted its head, just slightly, like it was studying me. That small, casual movement broke the spell. I bolted out of the room, down the hall, through the lobby, and into the parking lot, not stopping until my lungs burned in the night air. After that, I avoided mirrors. I stopped glancing at windows. I kept my eyes on the floor whenever I walked past the glass booth. But avoiding it didn't change anything, because the figure had followed me. I'd catch it in the microwave door in my apartment, in the chrome bumper of a car parked too close. Once, I saw it in the blank black screen of my phone after I powered it off. Always the same. Still, smoky, watching, and every time, the hum grew louder. I knew then the voices weren't trapped in the recordings. They weren't confined to the booth. They were alive, aware, and they had noticed me. And noticing was the first step to claiming. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind of night no one remembers because it wasn't supposed to be special. Just another session, just another round of takes. But that was the night the studio stopped pretending it was just a studio. Lil Nas X came in like usual, joking with one of the interns, sipping an iced latte, humming a line from an unreleased track. But when the engineers told him the downstairs booth was open, his smile faded. He didn't argue, didn't refuse, but there was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you the body remembers even when the mind won't say it out loud. Then he nodded and walked toward the silver-handled door. This time, the staff didn't carry on as usual. No one fiddled with cables or checked levels. They gathered. One by one, they drifted toward the control room, standing silently at the edges, watching the monitors. Their faces were blank, eyes glassy, like they weren't waiting for a performance. They were waiting for something else. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to focus on the sliders, but the air had shifted. It was heavy, humid, charged like the moments before a thunderstorm. The feed from the basement booth flickered on the monitor. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Lil Nas X adjusting his headphones, testing the mic. But as soon as he opened his mouth, the hum returned. Not faint this time, not tucked under the mix. It came roaring through the speakers, vibrating the glass of the control room, pressing into our chests. And then, something worse. The staff began to hum with it. softly at first, under their breath, like they didn't even know they were doing it. Their tones overlapped, dissonant, messy. But the longer it went on, the more it synced, until a unified rhythm filled the room. My skin prickled, my stomach twisted. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't music. It was communion. On the screen, Lil Nas X's body swayed. His eyes were closed, his face serene, but the sound pouring out of him wasn't human. It came in layers, voices stacked in impossible harmonies, some too high, some too low, some that didn't even sound like voices at all. One growled like stone grinding against stone. Another crackled like fire. Another hissed like steam escaping from a broken pipe. The engineers didn't flinch. They leaned closer, breathing in rhythm, humming louder. One of them placed a hand on the glass of the control booth window, and the others followed, palms flat against the barrier like they were worshiping the sound itself. I wanted to move, I wanted to scream, but my body refused. The hum was inside me now, rattling my bones, syncing with my pulse. For a moment, I thought I might join them, that my throat might open against my will and spill out the same guttural tones. Then Lil Nas X's eyes snapped open. He stared straight into the camera, straight at us. But his eyes weren't his anymore. They were darker, deeper, reflecting something that wasn't in the booth, something that wasn't in this world. And when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. Let it in. The staff obeyed instantly. Their hums grew louder, their bodies swaying in time, some of them trembling as if something was moving through them. The chandelier in the control room rattled, though no one touched it. The monitors flickered. Shadows stretched too far across the walls, bending into shapes that didn't match the people casting them. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. I knew if I joined, if even one sound left my throat, I wouldn't stop. I'd be part of it. And whatever was feeding on him, whatever was filling this room, would claim me too. So I sat frozen in my chair, hands gripping the console, heart hammering, while the others gave themselves over to the sound. And in that moment, I understood. The booth didn't just take voices. It was teaching us how to open the door wider. After that night, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unhear it. What had happened in the control room wasn't a performance. It wasn't even about music anymore. It was about opening a door, and I had watched people walk through it willingly. But what shook me most wasn't just what happened in the studio. It was how normal everyone acted afterward. The next morning, they greeted each other with tired smiles, complained about the coffee being stale, and joked about deadlines. No one spoke about the chanting. No one mentioned the way Lil Nas X's voice had fractured into something inhuman. They carried on like it was routine. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't the booth malfunctioning. This wasn't a glitch. It was the industry. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How certain artists came in radiant, buzzing with energy, and left looking hollowed out. How their early demos carried sparks of raw creativity, but the tracks released to the world sounded heavier, layered with something more than talent. How label reps spoke about essence and longevity with the kind of cold precision usually reserved for balance sheets. It reminded me of rumors I'd heard years ago, whispers about other stars, other studios. A singer who walked in with the clearest gospel tone but left a session unable to hit the same notes ever again. A rapper whose freestyle energy vanished overnight replaced by polished verses that sounded too perfect to be human. A producer who bragged about a sound no plug-in could touch, then disappeared from credits entirely. Pieces began to line up, threads weaving together into a picture too big to ignore.
This wasn't about one booth. It wasn't about one artist. The studio was just one mouth of a larger system, a system that had been feeding for decades.
The silver-handled door wasn't unique. There were others. Different cities, different studios. Hidden rooms buried under polished surfaces, humming with the same low tone. Each one a channel. Each one a vessel. Each one connected to something no contract could explain. And the voices, they weren't random. They were curated. I went back through old files, sessions I'd archived and forgotten. The pattern was there all along. Tiny fragments of people's essence stitched into tracks that didn't belong to them. Background singers, demo artists, interns who dreamed of making it big. Their voices lived on, but not in their own work. They were buried inside someone else's success. It was like the industry had found a way to recycle souls. And the more I dug, the more I realized Lil Nas X wasn't the first. He was just the next. The machine had chosen him because he was visible, magnetic, undeniable. The booth hadn't created his talent, but it had amplified it with the pieces it stole from others. The industry didn't just sell music, it sold vessels. And once I understood that, I couldn't hear the radio the same way again. Every chart topper, every anthem, every voice that made millions scream in arenas, I couldn't help but wonder, whose breath was that? Whose soul had been carved up and sewn into the chorus? It was a horrifying thought. But the worst part wasn't realizing how big the pattern was. The worst part was realizing I was already part of it. Because every time I played those stems back, every time I leaned in too close to hear what wasn't supposed to be there, I felt the hum grow louder inside me. And I knew it was listening back. I told myself I could walk away. That if I stopped showing up for sessions, stopped opening files, stopped pressing play, maybe the hum would fade. Maybe the voices would leave me alone. I was wrong. The first night I stayed home, I thought I'd finally escaped it. My apartment was quiet. The city outside muffled by rain against the windows. I tried to lose myself in something simple. Reheating leftovers. Scrolling aimlessly through my phone. But when I turned off the lights and let the darkness settle, the silence wasn't silent. It was there. The same low vibration, faint but steady, humming under the noise of the refrigerator, under the buzz of the streetlights outside. It wasn't in the room. It was in me, pressing against my ribs, echoing through my skull. I barely slept, and when I finally drifted off, the dreams began. I was back in the booth downstairs, the foam-lined walls pulsing like lungs. Lil Nas X stood in front of the golden microphone, but his face wasn't his. It kept shifting. One moment a woman I'd recorded months earlier. The next a gospel singer whose demos never got released. The next, my own reflection. All of them pressed together, mouths open, screaming without sound. And behind them, the mic glowed brighter than fire. When I woke, my pillow was soaked. My throat raw, like I'd been shouting in my sleep. That morning, I found scratches down my arms. Thin, red lines, just like the ones I'd left on myself trying to escape the booth. Except this time, I hadn't been anywhere near it. It didn't stop there. Everywhere I went, I felt watched. Not just paranoia, actual eyes burning into me. At first it was subtle. A figure in the corner of my mirror, gone when I turned my head. A shadow leaning in the reflection of a darkened window, though the room was empty. Then it became bolder. One night, I powered off my phone and set it on the counter. In the blank screen, I saw it, the same tall, smoke-like figure, eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I threw the phone across the room, but when I picked it up again, the reflection was still there. And then came the SUVs, black, unmarked, too clean. They started showing up at the corner of my block, parked with engines idling, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Some nights they sat there for hours. Other nights they appeared only long enough for me to notice them before pulling away. No one else seemed to care. Neighbors walked their dogs, joggers passed by, and the SUVs were just part of the scenery. But I knew better. I knew what they were watching for. Emails began appearing in my inbox. No subject line, no content, just timestamps. Random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during sessions. I deleted them at first, but they always returned. Same format, different hours. I never replied. I didn't dare. By then, I had stopped sleeping properly. Every creak in the apartment felt like footsteps. My dog barked at empty hallways, ears pinned back, growling at nothing I could see. And always, when the house finally went still, the hum would return, steady and patient, filling the silence with its promise. It hadn't forgotten me. It was waiting. And I knew sooner or later I'd have to go back. By the time I returned to the studio, I already knew it wasn't about music anymore. The hum had followed me home, invaded my dreams, clawed itself into my body. Staying away hadn't freed me. It had only made it stronger. The silver-handled door was already open when I arrived. No one else was around. No engineer sipping coffee, no intern scrambling with cables. Just silence, waiting. I descended the stairs again. This time, I didn't fight the pull. My chest tightened. My vision swam, but I kept moving until I was back in the booth below. The golden microphone pulsed like it remembered me. Its glow throbbed in rhythm with my heart. Each beat louder, heavier, until I couldn't tell where my body ended and it began. The silence pressed against me again, suffocating, erasing every sound I thought I could trust. And then the voice returned. "You've heard us." It wasn't one voice anymore. It was many, stacked, layered, too many to count. Some I recognized. The trembling soprano of a demo singer, the rasp of a rapper who disappeared, the flutter of my own breath patterns buried in Lil Nas X's stems. Others were stranger, older, voices that didn't sound human at all. You know what we are. My knees buckled. I pressed myself against the wall, the foam rippling like wet flesh under my hands. I tried to speak, but my throat locked. My mind filled with flashes, the session where Lil Nas X's eyes turned black, the engineers chanting without knowing, the reflection that followed me into every mirror. All of it connected, all of it deliberate. The booth wasn't just a room. It was a vessel, a place where voices weren't recorded but consumed, stripped from one body and sewn into another. It was how stars became untouchable, how music grew beyond human limits. Every it factor, every voice that felt larger than life, every career that skyrocketed while others faded. It wasn't chance. It was theft. And now, it wanted me to understand the final piece. On the pedestal, the mic glowed brighter. I saw their faces in the light. Kelly, Michelle, the nameless interns, the pop idols who never made it past one hit. Their mouths were open, their voices stitched together, whispering in unison, "He carries us now. Lil Nas X." That was why the booth had chosen him. His voice was magnetic on its own, but with every session, it had absorbed more. More layers, more fragments, more souls. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a vessel carrying the weight of those who had been drained before him. The hum rattled through my body, pulling me closer to the mic. My lips trembled, words clawing at my throat. That same unpronounceable name trying to force itself free. The promise pressed against me again. Say it. Say my name. Join us. For a second, I almost did. The hunger was overwhelming. To never be invisible again. To never fade. To live forever inside the voice of someone the world couldn't stop listening to. But then I remembered the eyes in the mirror, the hollow faces of those drained dry, the way Kelly and Michelle had once walked into a studio radiant and walked out broken. I remembered the girl with the demo that never got released, her voice now trapped in someone else's chorus. I clamped my jaw shut. My breath came ragged, my body shaking with the effort of refusing. The mic screamed inside me. Not sound, but sensation, a tearing pressure that made me think my skull would split. And then, silence. The light dimmed. The hum eased back into the walls. The mic pulsed slower, as if it had lost interest. I staggered backward. The door behind me clicked open. I didn't wait. I ran, crashing up the stairs, bursting into the hallway like I'd broken through water after drowning. The studio upstairs looked normal again. Engineers laughing, music leaking faintly from another room. No one looked up. No one noticed the sweat soaking my shirt, the blood from where I'd bitten my lip. To them, nothing had happened. But I knew. I knew the truth of the booth. The truth of the voices, the truth of what the industry had been feeding all along. And I knew that Lil Nas X wasn't just making music anymore. He was carrying something far older, something that had been waiting beneath the floorboards long before he was born, something that would keep whispering until the world finally listened. And the worst part? They already were.